I met the Trap-Mender on the journey from Husum to Tönning, through North Frisia, where the mudflats spread out like a great greyish-brown cloth, like a piece of sky that vanishes twice a day under the water, and twice a day emerges again from nothing. He sat across from me, a smaller man, compact, with a face wrinkled like very, very old leather, with deep creases like a map of time, with eyes that were yellow, almost amber, from many, many years beneath the sun at the flats, beneath the bright, shining sky. His hands were small but mobile, lively, the hands of a man who'd spent his whole long life making small, precise movements, craftsman movements, tying knots, artistic knots, mending nets, stitch after stitch, assembling traps, piece after piece. He wore dark work clothes studded everywhere with fish scales that gleamed like tiny mirrors, like tiny lights, and across his knees lay a large fish trap, a magnificent trap, half finished, the weaving not quite complete, as though he would continue working whilst the train travelled, as though the work could never stop, as though one couldn't travel by train and work at the same time. I asked him what he did professionally, and he looked first at his hands, at the trap he held before him, before he answered, as though when you ask an important question, you first ask the heart before you speak. The word he said was Trap-Mender, and he said it with a kind of sadness, not bitter sadness, but loving sadness, as though he were giving a name to an extinct profession, a dying craft, giving it one last name, a profession that would soon cease to exist when he was gone. A trap-mender, he explained quietly, was a man, an old man, who repaired, maintained, assembled fish traps. Not the great modern traps, not the commercial ones, but the traditional, hand-woven traps that had been built for 100 years and longer, perhaps 200 years, in the Frisian mudflats, in this place that the tides govern. These traps were made entirely of woven material, entirely hand-woven, from willows or other flexible woods that people knew, that people understood. And they were meant to catch fish, yes, that was the task, but also to let them go again if they were too large, or when the time came, when the fish had earned mercy. That was the philosophy, he said with pride, the old philosophy of the mudflats. Not to catch everything you could, not to take everything you could see, but only to take what you needed, only what nature gave you. He told me how long it took to build a fish trap. At least 2 weeks, sometimes 3 full weeks, sometimes 4, if the trap was large or particularly complex, particularly artistic. You began with the skeleton, with the rigid framework of stronger woods, perhaps oak, perhaps hazel, and then you wove the walls, layer upon layer, round layer upon round layer, ever denser, ever more precise, until the trap took shape, until it began to look like a living organism, like an animal, like a snare that was gentle and not harsh. And most important was the inner funnel, the special technical part, the geometric part, where the fish swam in, gliding inward, smoothly, but from which it wouldn't easily swim out again, not without effort. That was the highest art, to build a trap that was clever, that understood, truly understood, how a fish thought, the psychology of the fish, how a fish moved, its instincts, its thinking, how a fish could be deceived by form, by the opening. Over the years, and there were many, more than 50, perhaps more than 60, the work hadn't become easier, but rather harder, considerably harder. His eyes had grown weaker, his fingers no longer so swift as they once were, no longer so precise and sure as they'd been in youth, in the good years. But the fish, he said with a fine smile, still wanted the same kind of trap, still wanted the special funnel, still wanted the trap to be handmade, made by human hand, not by machine, not computer-controlled. Because a factory-made trap didn't have a soul, not really, not this soul. And the few fishermen who remained in the mudflats, the traditionalists, the old men, they knew that his traps were the best of all, because he understood, intuitively, deeply understood, what the fish wanted, their psychology, their thinking, their fear. And he breathed life into the trap without realizing it, without knowing it, simply through love of the work. The mudflats themselves were a living place, alive and breathing, he said, a place that never stopped changing, transforming, renewing itself. Twice a day, the water came, flooded in like an invasion, like a gentle invasion. Twice a day, it went away, disappeared, withdrew back into the North Sea. And each time, each flood and each ebb lay all manner of things on the bottom of the flats. Old traps, damaged traps, shell fragments, algae, animals, fish that had escaped too late. And when the flood came, the great flood, then the traps lifted, floated for hours in the water, floated free, waiting for the fish, for the eels, for the plaice, for everything that wandered through the flats, that went along the waterways. And when the ebb came, when the water withdrew, then the traps sank again, lay on the mud, on the bottom, on the ground. And the fishermen came, the early fishermen, in the early morning hours, gathered what had been caught, inspected, repaired what was damaged, mended the traps for the next cycle, for the next flood, for the next life. He showed me the trap he held before him, very carefully, very tenderly, as though it were fragile, as though it were precious. And I could see how perfect the handwork was, how artistic, how every single strip of wood was in its perfect place, how the forms flowed together like music you could read with your eyes, like a song in wood. He said this particular trap, this last trap, was for an old fisherman, a man he knew, a man who was old like him himself, perhaps older, who didn't have much more time left in the world, whose time was running out. And this trap, this last great trap, was to be a work of art, a true work of art, a monument, a memorial to all the years this fisherman had spent at the flats, all the early mornings, grey and still, all the ebbs and floods, the millennia, all the fish he'd caught, all the decades he'd lived in this place, beneath the Frisian sky, beneath the great, open sky of the north. Autumn was very beautiful at the mudflats, wonderfully beautiful, especially when the air grew clear, when the air was crystalline, and when you saw the birds, the migratory birds, the thousands of birds gathering before they flew away to the far south, to Africa, to warmth. The nights grew longer, longer and longer, and the moon shone bright on the flats when the tide went out, when everything gleamed like silver, like glass, like the face of God. In this time, the Trap-Mender said softly, he felt most deeply that his life would end soon. Not from sadness, not from fear, but from a feeling of completeness, of fulfillment, of a life that had been lived. He'd lived his life here, in this place. He'd done what he should do, what he was meant to do. He'd made beautiful things with his hands, with his mind, with his heart. And if he simply stopped now, if the traps went on without him, went on into the next century, then that would be all right too. That would be right. That would be the law of nature. Nothing stays. Everything transforms. Everything continues. Without you, the world doesn't end when you die. And as the train traveled through the flat Frisian landscape, as we drew closer to the Mudflats, closer and closer to this place, to this mystery, the Trap-Mender beside me grew ever quieter, ever gentler, ever more at peace. His hands continued working on the trap, but they worked more slowly, more rhythmically, as though in a dream, as though in meditation, as though in a song that had been sung 1,000 times for 1,000 years. The trains rattle over the rails, ta-dum, 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 and it was like the rhythm of the water at the flats, like the ebb and flood, like the eternal back and forth that never ceased, never, as long as there were days and nights. And I imagined how tomorrow this old man would return to the flats, how he'd slowly descend to the basins, to the traps, how he'd place his traps in the water, very gently, without hurry, how the fish would come and swim through the weaving, through the openings, not captured, not violently, but with a kind of understanding, of mutual respect and love, as though they knew these traps weren't hostile, not evil, but part of the path they had to walk, part of the life that was dying and living at once, end and beginning, in a single movement. It's early afternoon, and I'm sitting on the train from Nuremberg to Regensburg, when I notice something rather peculiar. The train is rushing through the Franconian landscape, past fields and small villages, but my attention is suddenly drawn elsewhere, to the row in front of me. There sits an elderly man, perhaps in his late 70s, wearing a light striped shirt and a grey waistcoat. I can only see him through the gap between the seat backs, but his behaviour is so unusual that I can't look away. The man is tapping his right index finger, tap, 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 against his knee, a regular rhythm, as though counting to music only he can hear. Tap, tap, tap. His lips move slightly, very quietly, but I see it clearly. He's counting, of that I'm sure. The movement is too precise, too intentional to be anything else. But what? I lean back slightly to observe him better without his noticing. The train continues on, we pass a small station without stopping, and the man simply keeps counting. Tap, tap, tap. After several minutes, the man reaches into his breast pocket and pulls out a dark brown leather notebook. It's old, the leather worn and polished at the edges, as if it has known hands for decades. He opens it carefully, flips through the pages. I see from my seat many, many notes, little numbers and marks, and writes something on a fresh page. A number, perhaps 30, perhaps 60. I can't read it clearly. Then he puts the notebook away and begins anew. Tap, tap, tap. The next count begins. Now I'm utterly captivated. What is this man counting? My mind works furiously. Telegraph poles? We're just crossing a bridge. And I try counting myself for a moment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, we're moving faster. Houses? But those are much too far apart for this constant rhythmic movement. Heartbeats? That occurred to me, and suddenly it seems terribly plausible. An old man counting his own heartbeat, hour after hour, day after day, and writing these numbers in his notebook, a secret record of his own life, measured in beats. I realize I've unconsciously started counting my own pulse. It's peculiar to become so aware that you're alive, that blood flows, that the heart works tirelessly, beat after beat. The man has this awareness, this constant connection to his own body. There's something soothing in it, something meditative. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm becomes my rhythm. The train vibrates slightly, and the man simply keeps counting, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. About half an hour later, the man pulls out the notebook again. His hands tremble slightly. Not much, but I notice. He writes a new number, perhaps also a comment, a word alongside. Then he closes the book and leans his head against the windowsill. For a moment, he seems to rest, but his finger on his knee, it continues to move. More gently, but without stopping. Tap, tap. It's as if he cannot help it, as if it's become a part of his body, like breathing. I try to look between the seats and see his face. His profile is sharp, thoughtful. The eyes are light, perhaps blue or grey. They stare out at the passing landscape, but I have the feeling he actually sees nothing but the numbers in his head. He's completely absorbed in it, completely with himself. There's something at once tragic and wonderful about observing this quiet devotion. He's not doing it for anyone, not for the world outside. He's doing it for himself, for this notebook, for this secret record. The train begins to break as we approach Regensburg. The rhythm changes. The train slows. The sounds become different. And the old man, his finger stops. Quite suddenly, the movement ends. He sits completely still, his hand resting on his knee. The notebook comes out once more, but this time he writes longer, several lines, perhaps an entire paragraph. I can't read it, but I'd love to. What does he write when it ends? Is it a summary? A thought? A prayer? The train stops, and through the speakers comes the guard's voice. Regensburg Hauptbahnhof. The man stands. He folds his notebook carefully, puts it back in his pocket. Then he takes his small rucksack from the overhead rack, unhurried, not slow, simply at his own pace. I lean forward to see him better, and for a brief moment our eyes meet. His eyes are grey. There's no surprise in them, no curiosity, only deep, quiet concentration. Then he turns away and goes. I remain seated and watch him as he walks down the platform. He walks steadily, upright for his age, his finger still tapping, not against his knee, but against his leg as he walks. Tap, tap. He grows smaller and smaller in the distance until he rounds a corner and disappears. And I sit there wondering, who are you? What are you counting? How many years have you been doing this? What do these numbers mean? What's really in this old notebook? But the answer doesn't come. It never will. The train moves again, and I'm left behind with my unanswered questions and that gentle, hypnotic rhythm still in my ears. Tap, tap, tap. It will echo in my memory for a long time. This quiet, mysterious man who counted his life in beats, writing them into a small leather notebook. The rhythm of life, measured and recorded, day after day, anew. And I sit here and feel my own heartbeat, much more conscious now, much more attentive, awakened by a stranger's quiet devotion. The train travels on towards Regensburg. The landscape changes, new passengers board, but my mind is still with that man, with his finger, with that secret record. Perhaps that's what drives us all, this need to count the moments somehow, to note somewhere that we've lived, that our heart has beaten, that we've been here. And slowly, as the train travels further, my eyes grow heavy. The rhythm of the train becomes my rhythm, and the old man's heartbeat becomes my heartbeat. Tap, tap, tap. On the journey from Goslar to Bad Harzburg, I met a woman who feeds deer. Yes, really, that is her life, her daily work, her calling in the deepest sense. She sat across from me in the compartment, and I noticed at once her hands rough as oak bark, hands dark spotted from forest floor, from snow, from damp earth. Her face was weathered, a face that has lived outdoors decade after decade, through all seasons. She wore a coarse woolen jumper, dark green as the forest itself, and when she told me what she did, her eyes shone with a tenderness that only people have who love their work like a craft, not like a job. Marlene, that was her name, tends to 7 feeding stations in the Harz, scattered across a wide area, reachable only on foot, with much time and sturdy shoes. The work begins, she told me, as soon as the first proper snowfall comes, sometime in November or December, depending on how autumn ends and how impatient winter is. From then on, she travels to, or walks to these places daily, bringing hay, bringing turnips, bringing corn cobs, all by hand, all with great care. In the deepest winter, in the January nights and February weeks, the wild animals depend on her continuity, on her love for this work. And the most beautiful thing, she said, the most beautiful thing is when the deer come. When you see that they know that here is a person, present for them, every day, without fail. It's not simple to maintain feeding stations, she explained to me. You must find the right height where the snow isn't too dense, but where the animals are still safe from hunters, from large predators, from the wild unpredictability of mountain life. Each place has its own personality, she said. One place under great spruces where the snow is blown by wind. Another in a valley where water comes from the mountain. A third on a slightly raised meadow where you can see the whole landscape. The deer learn these places the way we humans know the streets of our hometown. They know where the first place is, where the second is. They have their routes, their rhythms, their safety preferences. Marlene took an old camera from her bag. A camera already many years old, but still working, still making pictures, and showed me photographs. Deer standing and feeding. Deer whose eyes looked straight into the camera. Deer standing in snow up to their bellies in white. She could, she said, recognize every single deer by its antlers, by the way it walked, by the color of its fur. There was a great deer she called Conrad, who always came first, who was the leader. And then there was a group of young bucks, almost still kids, who were nervous but curious. And an old female deer she called Dorothea, who trusted her most, who often came very close, sometimes just a few meters from the feed. The photographs also showed the winter itself, showed me blankets of snow 1/2 meter high, showed me icicles on the trees, showed me how snow completely changes the landscape, makes it completely new. Every winter is different, she said. Every year, new snow quantities, new conditions. Sometimes it's so cold that the hay freezes and becomes hard as stone, and then the deer have to nibble it like wood. Sometimes there's thaw, and the feed becomes damp, and then you must watch that it doesn't start to mold. It's always a balance, a daily task of attention and love. She told me of a winter 5 years ago when the snow was so high she could barely reach the feeding stations, when she got lost, when night fell before she reached the second place. She had to spend the night there, in a small shelter meant really only for hunters, with nothing but her woolen jumper and a sack of hay under her head. But you know, she said, the deer realized I was there, and they came, and I heard the whole night how they ate, how they moved their jaws, how they protected me without knowing. That was, she said, that was the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me. Lonely and not lonely at the same time, alone and surrounded by 100 wild souls. In March or April, when the snow begins to melt, when the grasses turn green again and the trees begin to bud, then the feeding season ends. Then the deer can forage for themselves again, can find their own food in nature awakening. But until then, she said, I am their care, their safety, their hope. And there are moments, there are almost every day such moments, where I see gratitude in the eyes of these wild animals, a kind of understanding that this woman who comes to them with hay and turnips, that this woman is doing something for them, something that isn't taken for granted. She told me too of the difficult moments, of the times when not everything runs perfectly. There are years, she said, when the winter is so harsh that even with feeding, some deer don't survive, when illness comes, when accidents happen. Once, a deer, it was Conrad, the leader, whom she loved so much, injured himself on a sharp ice plate, and although she did everything to help him, she couldn't save him. She sat there in the snow and wept, she said, because she knew she couldn't control everything, that nature is sometimes cruel, even when you want to prevent it. But then, she said,
His children came to the place, and she knew that his life would continue in them.
The other feeding stations are as different from each other as people, she told me. One place she calls the Meadow Corner is open, bright, easy to overlook, but also exposed to wind. The older, more cautious animals always come there. Another place, under the spruces, is darker, more protected. The young animals come there, who aren't so nervous yet, who are still somewhat wilder. The third place is at a stream, and there she can see the deer drinking, and sometimes they stay there long, use the place as a gathering point, as a social place. It's like a network of meeting places, she said, like a communication system that the deer have learned over time. The effort is not small, she told me. She needed a car, even though the roads in winter are dreadful. She needed supplies of hay, turnips, corn cobs, which she had to store, which she bought in autumn before prices rose. She needed time, always time. And time is what you can't buy. Often, she said, she works from 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening, goes to 7 different places, and that every month of the year when the snow lies. Some people think, she said, that this is madness, that I must be crazy. But for me, she said, it's the most normal thing in the world. We traveled through the snow-covered Harz landscape, and I could imagine how Marlene trudges through this snow daily, without complaint, without hesitation. I could imagine the deer waiting, not impatiently, but with that wild patience animals have. I could imagine the moments when a great deer sees her and understands that feeding time has come, that today is again a good day when the belly will be full. And as the train slowed, led closer to Bad Harzburg, I felt that gentle loneliness, the great loneliness of those who work for others, who work for creatures that cannot speak. Marlene closed her eyes, and I closed mine too, and I imagined how tomorrow she would go again to the feeding stations, again spread hay, again see the deer come. The trains rattle slowly over the rails, ta-dum, 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 and I thought of the tracks in the snow, of the hoofprints of the deer, of the footprints of Marlene that she makes every day, trace after trace, path after path, and my breathing grew calmer, slower. The warmth of the train wrapped me like a blanket, the way snow wraps the world, and I could almost smell the cold mountain air, the air of the Harz nights. Everything grew worn and heavy and gentle, like the hay in the bellies of the wild deer, like the patience of this woman, like the stillness of the snow-covered mountains that keep watch whilst we all sleep. Ta-dum, ta-dum, the rails, the deer somewhere in darkness feeding, and I slept. On a journey from Zuhl to Oberhof, I met an old woman who spent her whole life gathering brushwood. Now, they'd tell you that's not work people do anymore, that it belongs to another time entirely, a time when folk needed wood to keep themselves warm, when there were no central heaters, no gas boilers, no modern conveniences. But this woman, Frida was her name, Frida still gathers, year after year, winter after winter, Because there are people who still know that nothing quite replaces a real wood fire. She had a face carved, it seemed, from oak roots, and her hands, well, her hands held all her lifetimes in them, every decade written there. She showed me her palms, and I saw scars from thorns, from sharp edges, from cuts so old the marks had nearly faded, buried beneath all the weathered skin. Frida explained what brushwood is. It's the small wood, the undergrowth, the branches from felled trees that are too thin for planks, too gnarled to be firewood in the proper sense. The brushwood gets tied into bundles, sold to people who have stoves, to folk with old houses and open fireplaces, to those who know that a good fire begins with good wood. The trick, she told me, is knowing which wood is good, which burns quickly and glows long, which makes too much smoke, and which burns clean. And then it's a matter of strength and patience, gathering all that small wood, sorting it, binding it into bundles. She gathers mostly in the woods round Oberhof, in patches of forest that private landowners have let her work in, day after day. The Thüringer Wald is vast, you see, really vast, and there's wood everywhere, branches at every turn, chances to gather all around you. In winter, she said, that's when it's best, because the leaves have fallen and you can see where the good wood lies, where the useful branches are. The snow makes it harder, mind you, but also more beautiful. Everything turns white, and the colors of the wood glow brighter against it. She goes out every day, she told me, even when it's 10 below, even when the snow's up past her boots. She has her routes, her known patches of forest, her favorite plantations where the very best wood lies. The process isn't a simple one, as Frida explained. You gather the branches, tuck them into a sack or bundle, carry them together. As time passes, your arms grow heavy, your back aches, your feet go numb with cold. But you keep going, because the forest keeps giving, because each new corner brings fresh chances. Then, she said, when your rucksack or bundle is full, you take it all home, and that's when the real work begins. You lay out every branch, sort them by thickness, by wood type, by how they'll burn. You separate the good ones from the spoilt, the ones too thin, too diseased. Then you bind them, and that's proper craftsmanship, I tell you, with twine or wire into bundles of exactly the right size, bundles that fit in a stove, not too large, not too small. She showed me old photographs, black and white pictures from the 50s and 60s, showing her as a young woman working in the forest with her father, gathering brushwood side by side with him, just as she does now. The photos showed a forest that looked wilder, less ordered, less tended by foresters, but the work was the same: gather, sort, bind. And Frida said she's never stopped since those days, that even now modern heating exists, there are still plenty of people who haven't forgotten the old knowledge, who still love a wood fire, who still know how to warm themselves properly by one. The hardest winter, she told me, was 1978, when the temperatures fell so far the trees began to crack, when the snow lay so deep she could only gather 3 or 4 hours a day before the darkness came. But she needed the money from selling her brushwood, needed it for food, for her rent, for the necessary things. So out she went, even on the bitterest days, even when the sun never properly rose, even when the snow was so cold it hurt to breathe. Once she got so cold she couldn't warm herself up, and a forester found her, brought her to his house, gave her hot milk with honey, and only after hours could she speak again. Now, she said, she's older, and the body isn't quite so robust, but her hands remember. They remember every branch, every winter, every fire that's come from her brushwood. She imagines it, she told me, her bundles burning in those stoves, warming people, families gathered round those fires. And perhaps they never know that up in the forest, an old woman gathered that wood, with fingers gone cold, with great respect for each single branch. She told me too about the different sorts of brushwood there are. Spruce branches are thin, burn quickly, give quick warmth, good for folk who need a fire in a hurry, who haven't got patience. Pine branches are denser, burn slower, give longer heat, better for long nights. And beechwood, she said, that's the finest of all. It burns steady, never makes too much smoke, warms you through the whole night. But beech brushwood is rare, hard to find, so it's dearer too. She knows, she said, every patch of forest, knows exactly where the beeches are, where it's worth going, where the best quality is to be had. She's known some of those woods for 50 years, knows which trees grow there, where the finest branches are, knows the sap and rhythm of nature the way you can only know when you've spent your whole life with it. Her customers, she said, are mostly older folk like herself. There's a man in Oberhof, over 80 now, who buys from her regularly. He's got a big fireplace and sits there all winter long, reading his books, and her brushwood burns beside him. There's a family, 3 generations of them, who order from her because the grandmother taught them that a proper wood fire never goes out of fashion. And there's a little restaurant at the forest edge where the chef burns only wood in his stove, cooks his specialities on it, and he says the fire from Frida's wood gives the best flavor. We traveled through the white forest landscape, and I could picture Frida moving through those trees, using her tool, a long wooden hook, to pull down the branches hanging in the upper limbs. I could see the branches falling, her gathering them, her sack growing heavier and heavier, her carrying on and on and on without complaint. And as I watched Frida close her eyes, I felt my own grow tired too. Felt the journey had grown long. The train rolled on. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. And in that rhythm, I heard the movement of Frida's hook in the forest, the movement of branches falling, the movement of her hands bundling them. All those movements repeated year upon year. And as I watched Frida rest, I felt the weight of her labor, the knowledge that each small bundle she's made has warmed a night, has brought a family together in warmth. This wasn't simply work. It was life. It was love. It was a quiet act of care for people she would never see. And the warmth round me became like the warmth of a fire burning from her brushwood, warm and old and reliable, and I could smell the scent of wood, of forest, of damp earth beneath snow, and my thoughts grew slower and slower, and I thought no more, but only was there, in this train, with this woman who'd given her life to wood. And everywhere in the forest lay branches waiting, and everywhere in the houses fires burned, warm and blessing. And I slept. On a journey from Zwiesel to Bayerisch Eisenstein, I met a woman who closes forest gates. There are many people in this world who do big things, loud and visible things. But this woman, Greta was her name. Greta does something quiet, something necessary, but quiet. She sat in the train and told me about gates, about forest paths, about barriers that are opened and closed, day after day, year after year. She was small, looked like a woman who'd folded herself down over the years, made small by work. But her eyes were awake, alive, blue as forest lakes. She had a rucksack with her, heavy-looking, filled with tools, locks, everything needed to guard those forest gates. The Bayerische Wald is a large forest area, vast enough for many paths, many trails, for forest tracks where big machines come to haul out timber. And at many of these ways there are gates, wooden barriers meant to keep ordinary folk with cars from simply driving into the work areas where the trees are falling, where dangers lurk. Greta is the person who guards these gates. They need to be open when the forestry lorries come, need to be closed when work ends. They need to be unlocked when hikers with permission want to pass through, need to be locked when the area's dangerous. It's a work of great responsibility, Greta said, because if the gate isn't closed, if someone drives through where it's unsafe, where trees are falling, where heavy machines are working, then there could be accidents, injuries, worst of all, deaths. And if the gate isn't open when a forestry lorry comes, then precious time gets wasted. Work can't go on. Someone loses money. So it's a balance, a daily responsibility, a task that needs care, attention, knowledge of the ways, the times, the dangers. Greta showed me an old map from her pocket, a map of the forest with all the paths marked, all the gates marked, with her own notes scrawled on it in thin, neat handwriting. Gate 7 needs new bolts. Path 3 closed tomorrow for felling. Hikers permitted till 5 o'clock. The map was old, worn from much use, folded and refolded till the creases showed like scars. But it was orderly. The handwriting was clean, the information precise. That was her knowledge, she said, what her brain couldn't quite hold, stored on paper. In winter, the work gets harder, she said. The gates can freeze shut, the locks can stiffen, the snow can pile so high you can barely reach them. Once, she remembered, she got stuck in snow at Gate 4. A snowstorm came up sudden-like, and she couldn't see anything, couldn't tell up from down. She sat there, in the snow, in the cold, could barely move. And then a forestry lorry came by. The driver spotted her jacket. She wears a red one so folk can see her, and he knew straight off she was in trouble. He pulled her out, took her to the nearest hut, gave her hot chocolate, and only after 2 hours could she speak again. But Greta said such moments don't stop her from her work. She loves the forest, understands it the way you can only when you're in it every day, when you live through the seasons with it, when you watch the trees grow, watch them fall, watch nature renew itself. She knows every path, nearly every tree, knows the animals that live in the forest, knows the birds that come in spring, knows the rhythm of the forest better than many foresters, perhaps better than any. She showed me photographs, old ones, in a small plastic album she carries everywhere. Pictures of herself from 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, always at the same gates, in the same forest patches, but growing older, yet staying constant in her devotion. "That's my life," she said simply. "That's what I do, what I am. I'm the woman who opens and closes the forest gates." It wasn't sad the way she said it. It wasn't unhappy either. It was calm, clear, filled with the knowledge that she did something important, something the forest needed, that people needed. The gates themselves have their history, she told me. The oldest gate is nearly 40 years old, built from solid oak. And though it's old, it's still sturdy, still reliable. Greta tends that gate with great respect, oils the hinges regularly, checks the wood for cracks, replaces parts when needed. Gate 3 is much younger, maybe only 10 years old, but it's already grown rougher from the weather, from summer sun, from winter's harsh winds. She points out where the first crack is showing. Small yet, but she sees it coming. In 2 or 3 years, this gate will need replacing. It's like medical knowledge, she said. You learn to read the signs. You know when something's failing before it completely breaks. And then there's Gate 2, which she and her late husband built together 25 years ago, when they were still young, still strong, still able to work side by side. That's her favorite gate, she said. Not because it works best, but because every time she sees it, she thinks of him, of the work they did together, of all those years they spent at the forest's edge. But the hardest part, she said, isn't the physical labor. It's the duty, the decisions. Sometimes, she said, someone comes up to a gate in a car and says they must get through, that it's an emergency, that their child is hurt, that it's a matter of life or death. And then Greta must decide, do I open the gate and risk a forestry lorry crashing through later, or do I keep it locked and risk not being able to help this person? She told me of a case 2 years back when a pregnant woman came to the gate with a swollen belly, said her labor had started, that she needed to get to hospital. Greta opened the gate straight away, let the woman through, even followed in her own car to make sure she arrived safely. The baby was born in hospital. It was a boy, and the family sent Greta a letter with a photograph of the baby, with the name Gregor, named after her. There were also the quiet moments, Greta said. The times when the gates were closed, when work was done, when she'd sit and watch the forest. Once, in deepest winter, she sat in her little hut by Gate 5, and a roe deer came out from the thicket and stared at her. They stared at each other for perhaps 5 minutes, she said, and in that time, she felt she and the deer understood each other, that they were both part of the same great forest system, that her work, opening and closing the gates, that all of it was part of a larger plan she didn't fully understand, but that she trusted. We drew closer to Bayerisch Eisenstein, and I could picture Greta, how tomorrow she'd go out again, how she'd open the first gate, how she'd make her rounds, how she'd watch over every path, every danger. I could see the forestry lorries coming, how they'd know Greta was there, that the ways were guarded, that it was safe to work. And as my eyes began to close, as the train slowed and drew nearer to its destination, still rattling over the rails. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. I thought of the forest gates, how they opened and closed, like the great breathing rhythm of the forest itself. I thought of Greta, alone in that vast forest, how she watches, how she stands guard, this quiet keeper of the woods. And the warmth of the train became a blanket round me, became a shield, the way the gate is a shield, and I could almost smell the forest, the scent of firs and earth, and my thoughts became like forest paths, winding and dark and soothing, and I slept. And in my dream, forest gates opened and closed, and a small woman with red hair, no, a red jacket, she guarded them all. On a journey from Treeberg to Hornberg, I met a woman whose hands looked like wood, whose fingertips bore scars from nails, from saws, from sharp wood fibers. Her name was Bernadette, and she builds birdhouses. Not simple ones, not plain boxes from the hardware store, but works of art in wood. Small architecture for birds, houses that are both beautiful and practical, that draw birds to them and keep them safe, that will last for years in sun and rain. She showed me her hands, showed me the cuts from saw blades, the sanding marks, showed me a burn from a soldering iron. Yes, she said, sometimes I need metal for the fittings, for the details. Her face was kind, gentle, a face that smiled a great deal, the face of someone who loves what they do. Bernadette started 20 years ago, she told me, when her husband passed away. She was alone, had a lot of time, had grief, and a friend gave her a tool, gave her a piece of wood, gave her an idea. Make a birdhouse. And that's what she did. Made a birdhouse, watched the birds come, watched them use it, and suddenly the windows of her flat were full of life, full of fluttering wings, full of song. And then she thought, this could be my life. This could be my work. Since then, she's made birdhouses, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, each one with great care, each one bearing her personal touch. There are different sorts of houses, she explained to me. There are small ones for small birds like tits, houses with an entrance hole of exactly 1 centimeter, big enough for the bird, too small for jays or sparrows that would steal the food. There are larger houses for nuthatches and woodpeckers, houses with an open side for robins and flycatchers. There are complex houses with several chambers where different bird families can nest at the same time. Each sort of construction needs different knowledge, different proportions, different details. The entrance diameter, she said, is like the door to a human house. Needs to be big enough, but not too big, not so big that predators can get in. The material is important. Wood only, she said. Never plastic, never metal. Wood has qualities plastic doesn't have. It lets the wood breathe, lets moisture evaporate. It's insulating. It's natural. She uses old timber, uses various sorts of wood. Spruce for small, quick-to-build houses, oak for large, sturdy ones, larch for those that need to last longer. She has a saw, has planes, has chisels, has sanders, has everything you need to really work wood, not just cut it. And she has time. Plenty of time, she says. Each house takes time. She showed me one of her houses. She had one with her on the train, wrapped in cloth. It was a beautifully made house, dark brown, with a sloping roof that overhangs like a real one, with details like small windows, decorative but lovely, with a hole at the side for cleaning. I could see how clean the joints were, how neat the workmanship, how much love was in every detail. She told me this house took her 2 weeks, 2 full weeks, and it's made from reclaimed wood from an old farmhouse in the Black Forest, wood that was already 100 years old before it became a birdhouse roof. Winter's a good time to build, she said, because the birds are active then. They need food. And when you're building houses, you can see straight away how birds use them. In the Black Forest, there's lots of snow, long, dark nights, and then people sit by their bird feeders and work on new houses. A good winter birdhouse, she said, can really save lives. If it's well made, stays warm, if it's protected from the worst winds, then birds can shelter in it overnight, can warm themselves, can survive the winter. She sells her houses to people in the region, to folks who love birds, to those who understand that a real birdhouse made from wood isn't just functional, but also beautiful. Some houses go to schools, some to elderly people who are alone and want to watch the birds. She has regular customers, she said, people who buy a new house from her every year, who fill their gardens with her houses till the birds don't know where to nest. And that makes her happy, gives her purpose, shows her that her work matters, that she does something that makes other people glad. She showed me too the different designs she's developed over the years. There's the classic model, unchanged for 15 years because it simply works, because the birds love it. There's the woodland house, very large, with several stories, that looks like a little castle where different bird families can nest at the same time. That's the favorite of schools, because children can learn from it how birds live together. There's the roof house, very flat, that you mount on actual building roofs so birds can nest in town. And there's the palace model. That's her masterpiece, she said. A house with carved details, with real windows, with a little balcony. It's more art than tool, but it still works as a bird's nest. One of her loveliest memories, she told me, was when she received a package from a teacher. In that package was a book, hand-bound, and in it were drawings of birds, all made by school children. These children had used one of Bernadette's birdhouses, had watched which birds came, how they nested, how they raised their young. And then the children recorded all these observations, painted them, and a teacher had bound it all together, and it was like a nature diary. A diary that was only possible because Bernadette had built those houses. She showed me the book, showed me the drawings, and I could see how happy it made her, how much it touched her. That, she said, that's why I love this craft. But the loveliest thing about her work, Bernadette said, is the connection to the birds themselves. She watches her houses, sometimes for hours, sees which birds come, which ones mate, which build nests, how the chicks hatch. She knows the behavior of different species, knows when they breed, when they feed, when the young ones fledge. Once, she said, she was sitting by one of her houses and saw a tiny chick poke its head out of the entrance hole for the very first time, looking out at the wide world. It was only for a second, but in that second she felt that this life, this little bird, this life was only possible because she had built this house. The feeling, she said, was like motherhood, was like creation. She's also started signing her houses, she said, like a real artist. On the inside of each one, in a spot where only the birds will see it, she writes in small letters, "Made by Bernadette, in the Black Forest, in the year." She knows no bird can read it, but someday, perhaps years from now, when the house gets old, perhaps someone will find that signature, and then they'll know that there was a woman who built this house with love. We travelled through the Black Forest hills, and I could picture Bernadette in her workshop with her saws, her planes, her chisels, working on a new house, her hands quiet and focused and loving. I could imagine the birds coming, using her houses, singing in the houses this woman made with such patience. And as the train slowed, as we drew nearer to Hornburg, still rattling on, ta-dum, 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 I closed my eyes and thought of the bird houses, how they sit everywhere in gardens and forests, little bits of architecture, symbols of human love for nature. I could hear the birds, their calls, their wing beats, and I could see Bernadette smiling, because her houses are being used, because they matter. And the warmth of the train wrapped round me, like the warmth of wood, like workshop warmth, and I could smell the scent of freshly sawn timber, and my thoughts became like little houses, like birds' nests, small and safe and cozy. And I slept, and everywhere in my dreams sat birdhouses, perched on branches, sitting in gardens, sitting everywhere people had wanted to give birds a home. On a journey from Železná Ruda to Klatovy, I met an old woman who gathers spruce cones. The word gathers is really too weak. She gleans them, as folks say in her part of the world. Gleans them together, collects them up, keeps careful watch over which cones are good and which aren't. Her name was Helena. She was 87 years old, and her eyes shone with the passion of someone who's done one thing her whole life long and still loves it. Her clothes were worn, well used, but they were clean, looked after, the clothes of someone who respects herself. She showed me her hands, bony, age-spotted, with nails worn short and tired-looking from decades of work. Spruce cones, she explained to me, aren't simply things lying about on the forest floor. They're the seeds of the spruces, and from those seeds you can grow new trees. The state, she said, the Forestry Service, they need millions of seeds every year to plant new trees, to regenerate the forests, to grow the timber of the future. And to get at those seeds, someone must gather the cones, must open them up, must coax the seeds out, must sort them. And that's her, Helena, who's done this for 70 years, since she was a young girl. The gathering starts in autumn, she said, when the cones turn brown, when they're ripe, when the seeds start to fall out. Then Helena goes out into the spruce forests of the Böhmerwald, and the Böhmerwald is vast, A great forest on the border between Germany and the Czech lands, wild and dense and full of spruces. She goes out with baskets, big baskets, and she gathers, gathers, gathers. A good day, she said, she can collect 50 kilos, sometimes more. A poor day, when the cones are sparse, maybe only 10 kilos. But she does this every day the weather allows. When there's no snow or gales, out she goes. She brings her collected cones home, and that's where the real work begins. The cones must be dried. She spreads them out on a big tarp, or, if it rains, in a hut, and lets them dry, sometimes for weeks. And as they dry, they open. The scales spread apart, and the seeds, tiny, tiny seeds with little wings, fall out. Then Helena must gather the seeds, must clean them, must remove dirt and wood pieces and damaged seeds. It's detailed work with eyes and fingers, work that demands concentration. But work she loved, she said. She showed me a little bag of spruce seeds, tiny things, barely visible, but each seed a potential new spruce, a potential new tree that might live 100 years or more. She held that bag like something sacred, careful, respectful, as if it weren't just seeds, but truly life, concentrated, waiting for its chance to grow. These here, she said, these might become trees in Germany, maybe in Poland, maybe everywhere in Europe, and all because I've gathered them. It wasn't proud, the way she said it. It wasn't boasting. It was simply the knowledge that her small, quiet work made great things possible. Once, Helena said, when she was younger, in the 50s, there was a time when the Böhmerwald suffered greatly because industry had poisoned the air, because acid rain fell, because the trees were dying. She remembers walking into the forest and seeing how the trees turned brown, how forests die, how nature collapses. And in those days, she said, the work was even more important, because people were trying to plant new trees, to save the forests, to do something, at least, against the destruction. She gathered even more cones, worked even harder, because she felt that every seed mattered, that every tree growing from her seeds was an act of hope. She told me of the different techniques she's learned over the years. The best time to gather, she said, is September and October, when the cones start turning brown, but before the seeds start falling out. You must take the cones with a certain gentleness, not too early, not too late. If you take them too early, the seeds aren't ripe yet, and if you take them too late, they've already all fallen out. It's a sort of knowledge you don't find in books. You can only learn through years and years, through experience, through mistakes, through successes. The best gatherers, she said, are always the older people, the ones who've been at it for a lifetime. Winters here are hard, very hard, she said. The temperature drops below -20. The snow lies so deep you can barely get through. In these times, she can't gather, can't go out. So she works at home, dries her cones, prepares the seeds, works on the bags, sorts, weighs, packages. She has customers. The forestry service buys from her, pays her per kilo of seeds, and it's a quiet income, enough to live on, if you're careful, if you don't need much. Once, she said, a forester came to her and showed her a photograph. It was a young spruce forest, maybe 10 years old, all small trees, but trees everywhere, life everywhere. And that forester told her,
This forest had grown from her seeds, that 10 years ago Helena had supplied these seeds, and now it was an entire forest. Helena wept, she said. She couldn't speak. That, she said, was the loveliest moment of her life.
Now, at 88 years old, Helena is slower. She can't gather as much as she once did, but she still does it, because it's in her blood, because the spruces call to her, because she knows there are still people who need her seeds. She's trained young people, she said, folks from the city who want to live in the country, who want to learn this craft. And some of them were good, very good. Some will carry it on, will keep the tradition going, will spread Helena's life's work. She told me too about the pests, the forest diseases, all the things that make cone gathering harder. There are years, she said, when the trees don't make cones, when they put all their energy into their roots, when you go out and find nothing, absolutely nothing. There are other years when pests eat the cones, when you find worms in the seeds, when you must sort very carefully to get good seeds. And then there are the good years, the blessed years, when the spruces overflow with cones, when you can barely gather the whole crop, when it's like a blessing, like nature's doing right by you, like a reward for all the hard years. She told me too that this year is a good one, that cones lie everywhere on the forest floor, that she's gathered more this year than in the last 10 years together. The trees know, she said mysteriously. The trees know that I'm growing older, that there's less time. They make many, many cones to secure their future, to reward me one more time, properly, for all these years. We traveled through the white Burmerwald landscape, and I could picture Helena, how tomorrow she'd go out again, baskets in hand, how she'd move beneath the spruces, how she'd gather, how her eyes would always be searching for the cones turned brown, how her hands would know which cones are good without thinking, pure instinct, pure experience. And as the train slowed, as we drew nearer to Klatovy, still rattling on, ta-dum, 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 I thought of all these seeds, millions of them, growing into trees all over Europe. And there was Helena, an old woman in the Burmerwald, who made all these trees possible, who works silently and unnoticed, who enables generation upon generation of trees. And my eyes grew heavy, and the warmth round me became like the warmth of millions of trees, all growing from Helena's work, and I could almost smell needles, could smell wood scent, could smell the earth, damp forest earth, and my thoughts grew slow, grew heavy, grew small as spruce seeds, small and hopeful, and waiting. And the train rattled still. Ta-dan, ta-dan. And the cones fell, and the seeds fell, and Helena gathered, gathered, gathered. And I slept. And everywhere in my dreams trees grew, millions of trees, all from these tiny seeds, all growing, all hopeful, all Helena's legacy. I met her in the Engadin, on the journey from Zernez to Skål, where the Alps still look the way they did before people started changing them too much. The sun was still high, though it was already summer, properly warm, and through the windows came the bright, clear mountain air. She sat opposite me, a woman perhaps in her mid-50s, with eyes green as the valley meadows. And in those eyes was a kind of attention I see only in people who've spent their whole lives looking at small things. Her hands were sun-brown, with unpainted nails, and scratches from work, from being outside, from years. She wore a green shirt, creased from rucksack and walking, and had a pair of binoculars, carefully set beside her on the seat. A notebook lay in her lap with a pencil, small notes everywhere, dates, numbers, words I couldn't read. I asked what she did up there in the mountains, what her work was, and she looked out the window first at the slopes before answering. I liked that straight away, the pause before speaking, as if she had to remember which valley she was looking at, which altitude. She said she was a warden, that she spends the whole summer counting marmots in the Engadin National Park. Her voice was quiet, but not nervous. She simply spoke quietly, because people who listen to marmots have learned to speak quietly too. She said the marmots become active around 5 o'clock in the morning, so long before the sun is properly up, she's in the mountains, sitting and watching. She sits there, perfectly still, sometimes 4-5 hours at a stretch, and notes every single activity. The Engadin National Park area, she told me, is almost 60,000 hectares, and marmots are everywhere, thousands of them. But few people ever see them. They're cautious, they're quick, and they know every stone in their territory. But the warden knows them too. She knows their burrows, their paths, their favorite feeding places, where they eat the first new vegetation in early summer, when the snow melts and the alpine flowers start to bloom. She knows their whistles. Yes, marmots whistle, to warn each other, to greet. And the warden has learned to tell those whistles apart, to know them the way you might know the voices of your friends. She's been doing this for 8-9 years now, and with each year the marmots become more comfortable with her, or at least they ignore her more, accept her presence as part of the alpine landscape. She showed me her notebook, and in it were hundreds, thousands of entries: date, time, number of marmots, behavior, weather observations, all recorded in fine handwriting. She said this wasn't just for her own sake, but that all this data goes into a great scientific project to understand how the marmot population changes, whether it's growing, whether conditions are becoming better or worse for them. With climate change, marmots have new opportunities at higher altitudes, but also new risks: less reliable food sources, more unpredictable snowfalls. Through her work, she said, scientists can see whether the population stays stable, whether the young grow well, whether the alpine landscape is still safe enough for these ancient creatures that have lived up there for thousands of years. The interesting thing, she said, is that marmots are very dependent on the rhythms of the seasons, more than most animals. They enter true hibernation, 4-5 months without eating, without drinking, with body temperature that drops like in no other creature. They need the winter, she said, for their development, for their biological clock. But with warmer winters, with snow that comes later or melts earlier, everything gets thrown into disorder. The marmots wake earlier, but there isn't enough vegetation for them, or they go into hibernation later when energy reserves aren't sufficient. It's a fine balance, she said, and each year, that balance becomes a little more disrupted. Then she told me about a particular marmot she always watched closely. An old mother with 4 young, and this woman had been keeping watch on her for 4 years. She could recognize the mother, she said, by a small scar on her forehead and by the way she walks, a slightly stiff gait, perhaps from an old fight or a fall. This mother was always the first to lead her young out to feed, always watchful, always alert for eagles and martin. This summer, that mother had only 2 young instead of 4 like in previous years. The warden speculated the food sources weren't rich enough, or the long spring drought had taken too much from her. She was worried about the old mother, but she didn't say it aloud. She just said she hopes she and her 2 young make it through the winter. I asked if it's hard, being so close to the animals every day, and not being able to influence things, not being able to save them when something goes wrong. She nodded, slowly, thoughtfully. She said, that's the price of this work. You watch, you document, you understand, but you don't interfere. Nature must take its course, even when it hurts. But, she said, simply by observing, by understanding, you help them. If we know populations are declining, if we see why they're declining, then policies can change. The park might be better protected, or hunting in the neighboring areas limited, or farmers made aware to use their pastures differently. It's not direct rescue, but it's a form of slow, quiet protection. She told me too about the mornings, how she gets up before the sky is light, how she takes her thermos of tea, her binoculars, her notebook, and walks up into the darkness of the Alps. She knows the paths so well, she almost doesn't need to look. Her feet already know where the stones are, where the path widens, where it narrows. And then she sits, completely still, and waits for the first sun, for the first marmots to come out of their burrows. The first light hits the highest peaks first, and slowly the world grows bright, and the marmots wake, and she notes, and the sun climbs higher, and the day begins. Quiet, very quiet. That's the best time of day, she said, when almost no one else is awake except her and the marmots, and perhaps a bird, a raven maybe. I asked how long she'd keep doing this, how long her body would hold up, all these risings in the dark, all these hours sitting still in the cold, on hard stones, without moving, only waiting. She laughed, but not bitterly. She said she knows she won't be young forever, that maybe in 5, 10 years her knees won't cooperate, her eyes won't see so sharply. But until then, she said, I must do it, must document everything I can still see. Each summer might be the last, and I don't want anything lost, anything not recorded that might matter. And then she said, even more quietly, it's my responsibility to see, to notice what the marmots experience, while most people down in the valley are brushing their teeth and don't know that up there, life is happening. The train was slowing now. We were nearing Squall, and the mountains were almost golden in the summer light. She said she has to go back up tomorrow morning, that she's only come down to Squall today to buy new batteries for her camera, some supplies, and then it's back, straight back to the mountains for the next 4 weeks. She has a small tent, she said, very small, on a meadow the village has let her use, and she sits there every day, almost every day, if the weather allows. That sounds lonely, I thought, but she didn't say it that way. It didn't sound lonely. It sounded necessary, like breathing, like drinking. It sounded like that's where she really lives, more than anywhere else. And I felt how the rhythm of her observation transferred to me, how her attention to small things began to grow in me as well. The train rattled on, but I wasn't hearing just the rattling anymore. I was seeing the haystacks in the side valleys, the rock faces, the snow patches still up high, and I knew that everywhere there, invisible to us, marmots were living their day, raising their young, preparing for winter. Thousands of small lives, documented by a woman in a green shirt who only listens, only watches, only notes, year after year. And my eyes grew heavy as the Engadin mountains flew past, and I thought of the old marmot mother, of her 2 young, now out feeding, now building their fat reserves for the long, cold months. My eyelids began to fall. The mountains faded a little from my sight, and there was only the warm summer light, soft, soothing light, and the train rattling, ta-dum, 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 always steady, always quiet, like the marmots who whistle, who know they are safe, are protected, ta-dum, ta-dum. I met her on the train from Brixen to Bruneck, the woman who digs gentian roots from the Dolomites. She was a strong woman, perhaps 60, with a face tanned brown by the sun from a lifetime in the mountains, a life on the meadows, a life with hands in the earth. Her hands were truly remarkable, large, broad, with fingers that looked like roots themselves, gnarled but absolutely strong. She wore a simple brown dress, and round her neck hung a small bag filled with dried gentian flowers, and the smell that came from it was bitter, spicy, ancient. She looked out the window, as if she weren't just seeing the mountain landscape, but all the gentian plants growing there in the earth, deep in the earth, their roots patiently waiting for decades. I asked what she does out there in the mountains, and she laughed quietly, as if I'd failed to understand something very simple. She said she digs gentian, that she pulls the roots of gentian plants from the ground, to dry them, to turn them into schnapps. It's very old, she said, very, very old, this tradition. Her mother did it, her grandmother, and her grandmother before her, perhaps generations back. Gentian grows everywhere here in the Dolomites, these beautiful blue flowers in summer. But what most people don't know is that the precious stuff is below, in the roots, sometimes meters under the earth. Hard, woody, full of bitter compounds, full of life. She told me that gentian can only be harvested in very particular months. Not in spring when the new flowers start to grow, and not in autumn when the plants move their energy down into the roots. The best time is summer, after the flowers bloom, when the sun has dried the meadows and the earth is loose. You have to know, she said, where the gentian plants stand. It's always the same places year after year. And you have to have a license to dig. You can't just dig anywhere.
only in approved places. In her case, she had such permissions from the municipality. She dug in designated zones, and always in a way that nature could regrow.
The digging itself, she said, isn't about strength, it's about skill. You dig round the plant carefully, not wildly, not too deep, because the root can break, and a broken root is ruined. You must work slowly. You must feel where the root lies in the earth. You must know its weight, its direction. Some gentian roots are 2 meters long, she said, thick as a parsnip at the top, then tapering like a whip. You must get the whole thing out without breaking it, and that takes patience and time. She showed me her fingernails, broken in many places, with dark stains in the cracks from gentian earth, from gentian juice, from years. That's the price, she said, of this trade. She showed me, too, a dried gentian root from her pocket, dark brown, hard as wood, with branching fibers like a tree in miniature. That's the beauty of it, she said. The complexity, the structure, the plant's years and years of work underground, completely invisible to people above. A gentian plant needs 7-8 years before its root is big enough to harvest, and all that time it sits below the earth, growing, storing energy, growing stronger. And when the root is finally ripe, then this woman comes and digs it out, and the root gets a new life. Not as a plant anymore, but as medicine, as schnapps, as something that heals and warms people. Once the roots are harvested, they must be processed quickly at home. They're washed, not with too much water, because that rinses out all the precious aroma, then chopped into smaller pieces. Then comes the schnapps, high quality, pure schnapps, and the gentian pieces are steeped in it, sometimes for weeks, sometimes months, depending how intense you want the color and taste. And slowly, very slowly, the bitter essence draws out of the root into the schnapps. The liquid becomes brown, dark, almost black, and the smell grows stronger, spicier, more ancient. That's gentian schnapps, she said. The best kind, the purest. No sugar, no additives, just root and thyme. A small glass after a meal. That helps digestion, that warms the stomach, that tells you that you've lived, that you're awake. She told me about her working life. Up early when it's still dark with her spade and her bag into the Dolomites, onto meadows that are sometimes 2-3 hours walk away. She works all day under the hot summer sun, bending down, digging, lifting the roots, putting them in her rucksack, wiping her brow, and moving on. Her back must ache, her knees, her hips, I thought. But she simply said it's normal, it's just part of the work. If you spend much time in the mountains, she said, you learn to feel pain differently. It's not something that distracts you anymore. It's just there, like the sun, like the wind, like the roots you're digging. She showed me, too, a sketch of what a gentian root looks like when you're digging it. From above, just a few leaves, a small rosette. But as you start digging, it gets deeper. The root becomes thicker, becomes larger, becomes older. Sometimes you dig 1 meter deep and the root still hasn't ended. A very old root, she said, can be 3 meters long or even more, completely underground, completely hidden. That's the plant's secret. Above is nothing. Below is everything. And when you harvest these roots, you take from that plant all its strength, all its stored energy, all its decades of work. That's why the harvest must be so respectful. You take an alms soul when you dig a gentian root. I asked if this work is still profitable, if there are still young people who want to learn it, who want to carry on this old tradition. She shook her head slowly, sadly perhaps. She said the business has become weaker over the years. The big schnapps producers now make gentian schnapps using industrial methods, with dried gentian roots they buy cheaply, with additives, with shortcuts. Her gentian, the handmade kind, the honest kind, costs more, and fewer people want to pay for it. Her 3 children, she said, don't want to dig. They go to the city, they find other work. Perhaps in 15-20 years, when she's old or gone, there'll be no one left who knows the old way, who knows the Dolomite meadows like she does, who has patience like she does. That's the way of the world, she said. Not angrily, just resignedly. That's simply the way. But she told me too of her regular customers, old people who've been buying her schnapps for years or decades, who understand that quality has its price. They come by, she said, and drink a small glass with her after the harvest, and they tell her this schnapps has helped them when nothing else would, that the bitter compounds have soothed their stomachs, strengthened their nerves. An old man, she said, lived to be 100, and he drank a sip of gentian schnapps after every meal since he was 30. She doesn't know if it was the schnapps or the mountains or simply living in the Dolomites, but she believes it played its part. But then she said something that stayed with me. She said, it doesn't matter whether the tradition dies or not. What matters is that someone lived it, properly, truly, with all their strength. She's lived with gentian roots, understands them, has left part of her soul in these roots year after year. And the gentian schnapps she makes, that's not just schnapps, that's a song from her, a letter from her to the people who drink it, a message from the mountains, a message from a woman who knows how to wait, how to be patient, how to respect the earth. The train slowed. Bruneck came closer, and the Dolomites turned purple-red in the evening light, and I felt my eyes growing heavier, and I still saw that woman, bent over the mountains, her hands in the dark earth, searching for the roots, for the bitter essence that lies hidden beneath everything. The woman beside me closed her eyes too, and her face became peaceful, relaxed, as if she herself were sinking into the earth, slowly, ever more slowly, and the train rattling, ta-dum, ta-dum, like the spading, like the work, blow after blow, the comfort of repetition, the peace of ancient labor, ta-dum, ta-dum, always on, always deeper, always warmer. On a journey from Innsbruck to Steinach am Brenner, I met a young woman, perhaps early 30s, with a face that shone from the sun and from contentment. Her name was Anna, and she was a sennerin, a shepherdess on the Arm. She spent the summer months on the high pasture at the Brenner, somewhere up there where the air grows thin and the mountains loom larger than people. She wore green skirts, traditional Tyrolean style, and in her lap lay a book on alpine farming, with many notes in the margins. Her notes, from a woman still learning, still curious. She gazed out the window at the mountains, and her look was so tender, so loving, as if she were watching her children at play. And probably she was, because the cows on the Arm were like children to her.
She called them all by name, and she knew each temperament, each peculiarity. She told me that every summer, from May to September, she lives on the Alm in a small hut with about 30 cows, a handful of goats, and sometimes sheep, depending what the farmers bring her. It's not modern farming, she said. It's old farming. It's an Alm the way it's existed for centuries. You drive the animals up when the snow melts. You milk the cows. You make cheese. And in September, before the first snow comes, you drive them back down to the valley. The work is physical, hard, endless. Milking every day, making cheese every day, checking the pastures every day, making sure no animal is lost, that no illness comes, that everything is in order. The milking starts very early, she said, as soon as the sun begins to rise, sometimes even before, in darkness. She knows the way to the cows without light. She knows their places, their habits. The cows are already waiting for her, Anna said with a smile. Their udders are full. They're ready. They need the milking. It hurts them when they don't get it. She has a name for every cow, and she speaks with them while she milks. Not just chatting, but real talking, with voice, with attention. She said that milking isn't simply milking. It's a relationship between human and animal. It's trust on both sides. The cows must trust her to be gentle, to not hurt them, and she trusts the cows to stand still, not to kick. That's not a given, Anna said. It must be built up, every day, with patience and consistency. After milking comes the cheese making, the larger task still. The fresh milk is heated in big kettles, treated with starter and rennet, then stirred, patiently, regularly, to get the right grain. The secret is temperature, Anna said, and time. You must have absolute control, or the cheese won't set right. After several hours, you have the curds, and they're drained, pressed, salted, then into molds, and then it sits, ripens, develops its taste, its character. A good Alpine cheese, she said with pride, needs time, weeks, sometimes months before it's ready to eat. It's not quick, it's not easy, but the result is something special, something you can't get anywhere else. She showed me a notebook where she documents every day the milk yield, the temperature, the cheese grain, the animals that are healthy, the animals that have problems. All this data comes together in her head. She knows that this year, with this warm summer, the cows need to drink more liquid. The milk becomes more watery. The cheese making is different. She must constantly adjust, constantly listen, constantly understand what nature tells her. This isn't routine. It's a continuous dialogue with the environment, and only very attentive people can do it. Anna is such a woman, and you see it in her eyes, in the way she speaks, with absolute presence. She told me of a moment. It was early June, and the Alm was just full of cows. The new ones had come out from the stables in the valley and were wild, excited, not used to the height, not used to the freedom. She was afraid, Anna said, that one of them would wander off, that they'd get lost, that they'd fall. But she learned to trust them. The cows know the Alm better than she does. The cows know where it's safe, where the good grasses are, where the ground is stable.
After a few days, the cows had settled. They were happier, calmer, and Anna could feel herself becoming calmer too. The fear gone, and only trust remaining. Trust in the animals, trust in herself, trust in the Alm. I asked if she gets lonely up there, completely alone with the cows and the mountains, not talking to people every day, no cinema or restaurants. She laughed, and it was genuine laughter, not bitter. She said she's not alone. The cows are her company. The mountains are her company. And now and then other Senarins come by, or a visitor, like the community manager, or hikers who stop at the Alm to buy cheese or milk. But even when no one comes, Anna said, she's not really alone. She's surrounded by life, by movement, by processes that happen every day. The cheese ripens, the cows thrive, the meadows grow, the mountains are there. That's enough company, once you've learned to listen to nature. She told me too of a particularly difficult time. It was in her second summer on the Alm, and one of the older cows fell sick. The cow, which she called Magdalena, got an infection, and Anna had to call the vet daily, bring medicines, care for the cow, take her temperature, help her regain strength. She spent nights without sleep, sat beside the cow, stroked her, spoke to her, perhaps prayed for her. After 2 weeks, the cow got better, became healthy again, and Anna was overjoyed. She said in that moment, she knew this was her trade, that she didn't want to be anywhere else, that the bond with these animals was more important than anything else. Magdalena still lives, Anna said. She's now the oldest cow on the Alm, and Anna knows every scar on her skin, every aspect of her personality. She said too that there's another side, the side of family, of tradition. She's the first woman in her family to run an Alm. Her father was a Senarin, her grandfather, but her mother never was, and for long it was thought Anna couldn't do it, that it wasn't possible. But she's proven that a woman can do it as well as a man, perhaps even better, because she handles the animals differently, more lovingly, more carefully. Now, in her third summer on the Alm, Anna said, she feels she's really at home, that this is where she wants to be, what she wants to be. I asked if she's afraid this trade will die too, like so many old crafts. She nodded, but not despairingly. She said, yes, probably. Young people prefer to sit in offices, live in cities, have an easier life. But perhaps, she said hopefully, perhaps there's a counter-movement. People who understand that real life, meaningful life, doesn't happen in offices, but where hands create something, where the heart flows directly into the work. She's already had young people at the Alm, watching, wanting to learn, understanding that this trade is a treasure, that you shouldn't sell everything for money. That gives her hope, she said, that perhaps not everything is lost. The train climbed higher, toward the Brenner, and the air grew cooler. The mountains grew even bigger, more rugged, older still. And Anna leaned her head against the window, and her eyes closed slowly, not from tiredness, but from peace. She no longer saw the mountains with eyes open. She saw them from within. She knew them. They were part of her. And I, too. I felt myself sinking into that mountain rhythm, felt the height making me calmer, felt my breaths growing slower, deeper, felt the thin mountain air drawing out all that was unnecessary from my body. The train climbed ever higher.
Ta-dam, ta-dam. The milking, the cheese, the rhythm. Ever returning, ever nourishing, ever safe. Ta-dam, ta-dam. And my eyelids grew heavy, heavy. And I too was up on the alm, with Anna, with the cows, with the milk, with the cheese. All of it so warm, so full, so right. On the train from Garmisch to Mittenwald, I found her, the butterfly counter. A woman in her mid-40s with eyes that shone behind horn-rimmed glasses, like two lakes in the sun. She wore a khaki-colored hat, a rucksack full of nets, a bottle of vinegar, small plastic boxes, all the tools of her trade. On her lap lay a thick notebook, filled with pictures, drawings of butterflies, each line careful, each color accurately painted. She was a biologist, she said when I asked, but the word biologist seemed hard for her, as if it didn't really describe her work. What she did was more than that. She counted, documented, understood the butterflies of the Alpine National Park every summer in the short time when butterflies are active. The Alpine Butterfly Mapping Project, that was its official name, she said, had been running for 10 years, and she'd been part of it from the start. The task was simple to state, but infinitely complex to carry out. Find every butterfly species in the park, count them, understand their habitats, their food plants, their breeding patterns. The reason? Climate change. As temperatures rise, butterfly habitats shift. Some species climb higher into the mountains, seeking cooler air. Other species disappear entirely, while new ones come from the south. The project was a wave-by-wave documentation of these changes, so scientists could understand how quickly nature is changing and what interventions might be needed to preserve diversity. She told me butterflies depend on very specific plants. Some species eat only one particular plant in their larval form, and if that plant is gone, so is the butterfly. The Apollo butterfly, for example, a large white butterfly with red spots, needs the orpine, an alpine plant that grows only on certain south-facing rocks. The Apollo caterpillar eats nothing else. If there are too many people climbing on those rocks, if there's too much erosion destroying the orpine, then the Apollo disappears. And within a few years, this species could vanish from the Alps, not from direct killing, but from loss of habitat. That's tragic, she said, not loudly, but with absolute intensity in her voice. The monitoring itself is wonderful craft. She goes out into the meadows of the park with her nets and her equipment, and she walks very slowly, very carefully, along set transects. These are routes that repeat every year so you can compare whether more or fewer butterflies are present. When she spots a butterfly, she catches it in her net, quickly, bravely, but gently. Then she holds the butterfly carefully, notes the species, the sex, the size, the exact location, the time, the weather. Then she releases it, unharmed. A net catch should never last longer than a minute, she said, or you damage the delicate wings. She showed me her hands, small scratches, a bit of dirt. Those were traces of 1,000 catches, 1,000 gentle touches. She described, too, how important temperature and light are for butterfly activity. On cool mornings, butterflies aren't active. They need warmth to activate their wing muscles.
On cloudy days, they fly less. After rain, they're also less visible. That's why timing is so important, she said. You must go out on the right days, at the right time, when conditions are optimal. That sometimes means she walks 5 kilometers and sees not a single butterfly because the weather isn't right. But when conditions are perfect, warm sun, light wind, clear sky, then hundreds of butterflies can flutter past in a single hour, and, she notes, as quickly as she can, every single one. She described a moment that touched her deeply. It was a very rare butterfly she hadn't seen in ages, a dark grayling, a tiny dark blue butterfly. In earlier years, she said, there were hundreds on the Alpine Meadows, but in recent years, the numbers had fallen steeply. This summer, in June, she saw one, just one, on a meadow above Garmisch. She was so happy, she said, that she wept. A single butterfly. That was proof for her the species wasn't extinct, that there was still hope. She took photos, noted everything, and she tracked that butterfly for a whole hour to see where it laid its eggs, which plant it chose. It was the orpine, the right food plant. A good sign. Perhaps, she said, hopefully, if the weather is right, if conditions stay good, there could be a pair next year, and the pair could lay eggs, and the larvae could grow. New life for the species, for this mountain. She showed me old photographs too, pictures of meadows from the 1980s, full of butterflies, completely covered in colors with 1,000 wings. And then current photos of the same meadows, and now there were only a handful of butterflies, perhaps 5, 10 per meadow. The change was drastic, obvious, undeniable. She said those photos were among the most important images she has, this documentation of change, of loss. Because the pictures say more than 1,000 words. They show the reality that can't be denied. I asked if she doesn't get discouraged by it all, by all the years of documenting decline, by all the species disappearing, by all the knowledge that perhaps you're not able to change the situation. She shrugged, but it wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was a gesture of acceptance. She said she doesn't know if her project will save the world, or even just the park. But she knows the data she collects matters, that it helps scientists understand what's happening. And sometimes, she says, such data leads to action. Perhaps a hiking trail gets rerouted to protect the Orpine rocks. Perhaps grazing on the arm is adjusted to allow more flowers for butterflies. Small things, but small things add up. And at least, she said, at least I'm doing what I can. She showed me too her field notebook, full of butterfly drawings, detailed anatomical sketches, wing patterns, colorings. She's learned to understand these butterflies, not just to count them, their body language, their flight patterns, their preferences. An Apollo flies differently than a grayling, she said. An Apollo is faster, more aggressive, flees more quickly when threatened. A grayling is more delicate, slower, flutters more than flies. These differences matter. They tell her whether the animals are healthy, whether they're stressed, whether the environment is good for them. A sick butterfly flies differently, and if you know the differences, you can see it. You can understand what's wrong. The train approached Mittenwald, and through the windows I saw the mountain meadows, green, full of flowers, and I knew now that everywhere there
invisible to most eyes, butterflies were fluttering, living, dying, breeding, changing. Millions of them, and a woman in a khaki hat was among them, with her net, with her notebook, with her quiet understanding of every wing beat. She leaned against the window, and I saw how her eyes slowly closed, half dream, half reality. She told me, as we parted, that butterflies are our teachers. They teach us that the world is more complex than we think, that every small change has large consequences, that beauty is fragile, that we must be careful with what we have. A butterfly lives only a few weeks, but during that time it lives so intensely, so present, so awake. That's also a lesson. How to really live, how to value every moment, how to see the beauty around you before it's too late. She hopes, she said, that her work will someday help people understand that we must have more respect for nature, more mindfulness, more love. And as I closed my eyes too, I saw the butterflies. Not real, but not unreal either. I saw them flutter on the meadows, white, blue, red, yellow, infinitely many, infinitely beautiful. The orpine waving in the wind, the flowers trembling beneath their delicate feet, the wings shimmering. The train rattling slower, ta-dum, ta-dum, like the beating of a butterfly heart, ta-dum, ta-dum, steady, tender, infinitely gentle. And I was no longer on the train. I was on the meadow. I saw the world through butterfly eyes, small, large at the same time, filled with color and light. And I slept, slept, slept. Ta-dum, ta-dum. The soft song of wings, of meadows, of mountains, that all lived, that all mattered, that all had to be heard.